Right, hey guys, today we're going to be making a tier list on the Sicilian defense from the white perspective. I'm going to be showing you the lines I think are best, the lines you should avoid, etc, etc. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So as usual for our tier list videos here, we have S being the very top tier, F being the bottom, and then like everything else in between here. And we're going to be starting off from the bottom here, F tier. And the very first line we're going to be putting in here, I just have to find it, is going to be, I'm not sure if they call it this, but let's call it the Nakamura variation because this is something that Hikaru apparently has had a bit of fun playing. So basically the Nakamura variation is here with Queen h5, and I mean this is pretty self-explanatory why this isn't good. The pawn isn't that difficult to defend here. You can go d6, you can go e6, you can even go knight f6 here, and then after takes go knight takes e4 here. Black just has big in development. And I mean, you can't bring your queen out here and expect it to be any good here. So I mean, it's fairly kind of nonsense move, but has to be said, right? And so along with that, another line which is sort of dubious, but probably not quite as bad. This one's a little bit more tricky. Is going to be the wing gambit, but again, this is also going to be going in F tier in my opinion. And basically, the wing gambit occurs after b4 here. And the white's basic idea is that after black takes here, they're either going to be playing d4 or quick a3. And gaining some very quick piece development on the queen side, also hopefully playing a quick d4 at some point. But unfortunately, this line just has a bunch of problems with it. Namely being that if black doesn't take on a3 here, which a lot of players who have studied this with black aren't going to do here. And the thing is you don't even really have to study this deeply. You only have to study like 1 or 2 moves deep to really know that either after d5 here or e5, black is doing quite well. For example, after d5 here, takes, already there's a bit of a trap that white has to be careful of. They can't take this because then queen e5 check and then losing a rook here. So they have to then go something like knight f3. But just generally speaking, being down a pawn here, they don't have a whole lot of compensation. And black is doing pretty well. Not to mention also after e5 here, you could choose to just protect the pawn like this. You do sort of weaken the diagonal bit, so you have to be careful white doesn't go for a quick like bishop c4, knight f3, knight g5 thing, which they sometimes can do, but that's also objectively not too scary. And so another line that also goes in the F tier, this is also a line where white moves one of their pawns up 2 squares. This is going to be the accelerated Grand Prix here, also going into F tier. And now the Grand Prix variation versus Sicilian, this one is typically where white goes f4 on move 3 here, but why doesn't white go move on move 2 here, f4? And there's a very good reason for that, which is that black can actually just strike in the center here immediately with d5, and essentially if white say like pushes their pawn here, then black will develop the bishop outside the pawn chain, maybe like bishop f5 immediately, maybe they also wait for knight f3 and then go bishop g4, and in general these positions just sort of resemble a French defense here, except a very bad version for white here, because not only is it difficult for them to pawn on d4, but it's also they've allowed black's light squared bishop outside the pawn chain, where if we compare this to a French, let's say they play f4 here just for like very direct comparison's sake here, like just notice how like for example this bishop isn't as easy to get out. And if white instead plays, for example, in this position, sorry, wrong one, after f4 here, d5, e takes d5 here, black has this very nice move, knight f6. We don't really want to play queen takes d5 because then we get hit with knight's hero of tempo here. But if we go knight f6 here and recapture with knight next, this isn't so great. And if white plays a move like c4 here to hold into that pawn, then we can play e6 and play a gambit, where essentially white has just created a lot of weaknesses with these moves f4 and c4. A lot of weak squares in their camp here. They've also been neglected in development, so this is very good for black here. And the last one going in the F tier here, this is one that happens a lot online. I've seen it at lower levels here, where people go bishop c4 on move 2, and this is called the boulder attack, I believe, and this one is also going straight into F tier. And basically the boulder attack here, bishop c4, as I mentioned, this one is very common at lower levels, but the problem is that unlike say after e4, e5, which is why a lot of players go for this, because like against the like these openings, right, the f7 pawn is sort of a weakness that they want to target, and very often like the Italian game is popular for that reason. Also the bishop's opening is quite good, but against the Sicilian it just doesn't really work the same here. A very kind of pleasant way that black can play is just simply go e6 and a quicker d5. They can also go a6, b5 here, and in general the bishop is just sort of buying granite here, and it's not very easy for white to really play this sort of thing here, hence why we're putting it in the F tier. And so moving up now to C tier here, we have some lines that are getting a bit better, but still these are lines that to me are feeling a little bit sketchy, and we're going to be starting off with, I'm not even sure what to call this line, we're just going to be calling it 2a3 here. White puts the a pawn up 1 square on move 2, making a very seemingly innocent move, but one that also has a little bit of venom that black needs to be careful of. And so basically the idea behind a3 here, it looks like an absolutely stupid move here, where you're just like making a harmless looking pawn move on the side of the board. You might even go h3 next, which some people will do, right? But this move actually has a bit of a venomous point here, and I think guys like Levi Rosman, he's also played this a lot online. He's sort of, I think he might have even recommended this in some like course he made. But basically the idea is that against something like knight c6 from black here, white's just going to sack a pawn here with b4 in similar style to the wing gambit actually, but I think this is a little bit more tricky to face here. The idea being that after like takes for example, black actually walks a very narrow sort of rope in these sort of positions here after something like c3 for example, d4, d5, a very natural move stopping white sort of advances in the center more, but after takes, knight a3, this position is already like very difficult for black to play here, and say they play a natural looking move like knight f6, here they are already losing after knight b5, queen d8 here, and d5, when after just knight e5, we just like bring all the pieces in here. And note how once again we just simply can't move our knight like this very easily because the knight c7 check, and if something like this here, they simply cannot hold this knight down long enough here. Knight fd4 here, knight coming into e6, they can try some further stuff here, but I mean if we look at this position, clearly something has gone wrong for black here. This is hanging and this is also a threat. However, the sort of problem with this line is that if black just plays g6 here, then this whole concept kind of starts to look a little bit stupid. Like if you go b4 here, bishop g7, like, I mean, what are you gonna do? Like rook a2 here, if you go knight c3, we can just play d6, hold this pawn here, we don't need to take it. And white just kind of looks like they've been doing a bunch of stupid shit, to be honest, and their position doesn't really make sense, which is why I can't put this anything higher than like C tier. And the other line that's going to be going into C tier is where white plays b3 on move 2. It doesn't have as much tactical sort of venom as the other line a3, but this one is sort of a bit more of a positional one, let's say. And basically white's idea behind this whole line of going b3 is kind of like, let's just say something like this happens, they go bishop b2. In general, they want to like pin this knight here. If bishop d7 happens, they want to go f4, knight f3, d3, maybe put this knight in d2, and just sort of have some nice positional pressure. Somewhat in the similar spirit of maybe like the Ross and Lima, you could argue, where white plays like here like knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. Very often we exchange off and then sort of put our pawns on light squares here. But black can play a little bit more proactively than just sort of playing like passively with d6 and like bishop d7 here. For example, e5 is a very active approach here. Yes, we do weaken the light squares a little bit, but it's not anything like too severe, since like white has been playing quite passively. Another line is also very strong here, and I think the very strongest actually is to play g6, trying to directly oppose this diagonal here. If white goes bishop b2, we have this nice line actually where we can play knight f6 here. And if like e5 for example, we just go knight d5, we don't care if white tries to go e6 here because we just go f6. And we're actually doing quite well here because white has given up their e pawn, which they spent like who knows how many moves moving. And yeah, we're doing quite well here. I think queen takes d7 might be the move here for some reason, but bishop takes d7 also looks fine here, e5 in the future, and we'll probably have some sort of space advantage. And also if white tries to take here on f6, doubling our pawns, well, they do give up their bishop here. You might argue like they have the d5 square, they can play bishop c4, they have control of the light squares, but the problem is after some moves like bishop c4 here, well bishop g7 first, and simply castles, black has a simple plan of going d6 and f5 here, opening up this bishop on diagonal here, getting rid of the doubled f pawns, and just simply because of the factor once again that black has a bishop pair here, black is already maybe slightly better. And now coming back here, we're launching up to the B tier now. And this is where stuff starts to get a little bit more serious here, and we're going to be putting the Smith-Morrow gambit into B tier. And the Smith-Morrow is of course a gambit that happens after d4 here, black takes here, and we go c3, basically saying like, you know, black, we're happy to sacrifice a pawn here, what are you going to do about it? And black, they can of course take the pawn here, but they also have some other options like declining with d3 here. They could also go knight f6, and this is sort of one con, I guess you could say, of the Smith-Morrow gambit. As we're going to see later, I put the Alpen into A tier here, so transposing isn't really a big deal here after like knight f3 taken eventually. By the way, we usually get this through the move order c3 here, knight f6, knight d5 takes here, And now we once again have the same position. But if you play the Smith Morrow, one pill you're going to have to swallow is that your opponent has his transposition and you won't always be able to get your beloved Gambit on the board. But that being said, the Smith Morrow alone here, I think is a very dangerous weapon actually, and players do know how to play against it slightly better now compared to like 10 years ago, where like I think there was this book called Mayhem and the Morrow written by this international master Mark Esserman, where he really popularized this gambit and made it go mainstream, where before everyone kind of like, what is this thing, it's like absolute dog shit, right? But like now people all of a sudden really took an interest in it, but these days it's sort of like died out a little bit. But I think nonetheless, if you study this, you can really turn it into a serious weapon. And by the way, just to show one game that really sort of made this variation really pop off, this was a game Mark Esserman played against a Dutch Grandmaster, Luke van Wheelie, close to 2700 rated at the time of the game. He was Mark like 2400 about here, so it was a big upset the fact he won this game here, especially in the opening like the Smith Morrow, which a lot of like strong Grandmasters, they sort of looked down upon this variation. They thought it's just like a stupid gambit which doesn't really work, but in this game he really showed some nice ideas, namely this one here, the after b5 here, he played knight d5, which might look like to some people just an idiotic move, sacrificing a knight, but as I've mentioned this idea before in some other videos on the Sicilian, this is actually a very thematic sacrifice here, where after black takes it, white takes it, and we gain a very nice initiative here. The e-file is opened. Once again, note how the black king is still in the center here. After something like d6, this can also become very dangerous here as diagonal, and that's exactly what we saw here. Knight c5, d6 here. Black tried to develop here, but once again, Mark isn't having none of this. He's not giving black a single second to breathe here. We're going immediately f4, trying to open up these files for our pieces. We saw some further moves here. Bishop g5, a very nice idea, basically saying to black, you can take this. But after this very sneaky move, queen e1 check here, king d8 and queen a5 check, I believe this is giving mate to the king after something like, well, king c8, there's queen c7, and if you go back this way, then we bring this rook over, and that's about good game. So Luke van Wheelie tried playing bishop e7 in the game, but this was quite desperate, and the rest of the game was kind of just a shit show, and Mark tearing apart the super GM. And now we discussed the accelerated Grand Prix earlier where white goes f4 on move 2, but this time we're going to discuss the actual Grand Prix where white plays f4 on move 3. And so basically this one, knight c3 here, and I should also note in all of these lines where white goes knight f3 or knight c3 on move 2, now that we're getting to some of these lines, black always has a bit of an option with what they can do. They're not forced to go knight c6 as we're mainly going to look at here. They can also go for stuff like e6 or d6, and once again, as many of you may know already, this reflects heavily on whether black plays e6, d6 or knight c6 on move 2 here. Against like the open Sicilians, of course, when white plays d4 on the next move. Of course, white has some other options here. They could revert back to like an Alpen. They could play some bishop b5 sidelines. They could play d3 or g3, aiming for a King's Indian attack. But generally speaking, I mean, the most popular move is, like, once again, d4, of course. However, one thing against knight c3 is that black can sort of afford to go knight c6, regardless of whether they go d6 or e6 against this move knight f3 or move 3 here, because against this sideline, they can go e5, exploiting the fact this particular move order where white hasn't played d4 on move 3. And it might look like we can play bishop c4, exploiting this diagonal, but then after this, black can play bishop e7, d6, knight f6, and they sort of, once again, similar to the b3 variation we saw earlier, kind of live with these light squared weaknesses, because once again, we have the space advantage in the center. But that isn't really the line I want to discuss, and we're not really going to be discussing this line in this video, just because it's like a very specific line. And also, not to mention, it's black is by no means forced here to play e5, and if you already play like an open Sicilian here, for example, after like d6, d4, I mean, I don't really see why you'd go through this move, or I'll just play this and this immediately. But what we want to discuss once again was the Grand Prix, and what I want to sort of get to here was the fact that the Grand Prix will sort of vary in strength against different moves here. For example, I think it's strongest against d6 here, playing f4, not so great against e6, and mildly okay against knight c6. Like, first of all, against e6, f4, I think just d5 very quickly here, and I never really saw the big appeal in this for white. Against knight c6, the reason I say this is kind of meh is, like, against g6 here, say they go bishop g7 here, the old main line used to be bishop c4 here, but the problem is that black quickly goes knight g7, like with e6, and then d5 here, and sort of nullifies once again this bishop on this diagonal, similar to how we saw in the bolder attack where white goes bishop c4 on move 2 here. Just trying to find this one. Where was it? This one here, right? But like, okay, it's not quite as bad as that one. I think it's probably slightly better. Maybe the engine will disagree. Probably, actually it will. But nonetheless here, from a practical point of view, I've never really liked these lines a whole lot from the white perspective. Sometimes you try to get in like a quick f5 here, but in general it's not so good. And so usually what people have been doing here recently is going bishop b5 instead here. I think there was also some like course by like Eugene Perlenstein here we recommended a4. I'm going to be honest, I don't understand that move. I haven't got his course, but bishop b5 is sort of like the more modern approach you could call it. Trying to like take here, but black has knight d4 here, and these positions in general I'm not a huge fan of for white. Like either you take here or you move the bishop back. You don't really want to lose a bishop pair here. So yeah, not a big fan of this for white once again. However, when black plays d6 on move 2, what is the difference here? Like, why do I think this is a bit better? And the big reason is that now when you go bishop c4, again bishop b5 might be good there, is that now when black plays e6 here and they go for the same setup, they effectively have to move their d pawn twice if they're going to play d5 at some point now, because they already spent that tempo on d6, which to my mind makes this an improved version for white. Like play typically continues somehow, like with d3, queen e1 here. You can't play this now because we just win a pawn. So that essentially forces black to castle here, but then we go like f5 and we sack a pawn. Very typical play for the Grand Prix here, and this is probably one of the best versions that white has. But even then, like objectively, black is still supposed to be like slightly better here, so it's like, is it really that good then? I mean, that's up for you to decide. I mean, of course, what the engine says and what happens in practice are two different things, so you also keep that in mind when we discuss this. And so a very similar line to the one we just discussed here, white also goes knight c3 and move 2 here, is going to be the closed Sicilian. And yeah, let's get this on the board right now. So basically the closed Sicilian is where white goes, instead of f4 immediately, they go g3. And this is very much resemblant of a Grand Prix in some sense, because eventually what white's going to do is play f4 like their general sub. A bishop goes to g2 here, a pawn d3, knight e2. And eventually we're probably going to play f4 at some point and expand on the king's side. However, the benefit of this is that we sort of avoid those early confrontations here. So the play develops a little bit more slowly, and black has sort of, they're not able to like directly punish us as well as they can sometimes in the Grand Prix. And to be honest, I think this is a bit of an underrated line, because like a lot of like the more flashy lines which happen on YouTube a lot of the times, it's like the Grand Prix, like how to mate your opponent in like 10 moves or some clickbait title like that, right? Whereas with the close Sicilian, you're not really going to get those very flashy games as often, but you will often get like very like more slow burning attacks where your opponent isn't really going to be able to handle the position so well here. For example, play often continues something like this here. We might get a position like this, d6 here. Something like this might happen, and white might go like h3, bishop e3, queen d2, f4, expand with f5, g4 here. And black needs to be very precise in the timing of like rook b8 and b5, for example here. If they play like, I don't know, like a6 here. Sorry, I think it's white to move out to, let's say a6 here. Bishop e3 here. If they don't play rook b8, which a lot of players in the database haven't here, they just play b5. They actually just make this immediate material bond here with e5. When white pretty much just wins material here, if, I mean, they take the pawn, they hang the knight, and if they take the knight, they just lose the rook like this. Like, of course, though, they can avoid those blunders by playing like rook b8, b5, for example, when if we go e5, then knight takes e5, and there's no rook hanging on a8. But nonetheless here, I still think these variations are quite playable. Also, I should note after f4 here, they again have to play something like bishop d7 because they go b5 immediately. There's e5 hanging material this time, since they can't take the knight, since we're protecting it with the pawn. And if they take the pawn, then, I mean, we just play bishop takes c6 once again. So a lot of these small tactical ideas which players might fall into depending on your level, but even then, if they don't fall into these ideas, I still believe that there's a lot of venom in this sort of like slower kingside attack, which isn't so easy to handle. And so the last line that goes into the B tier is going to be the King's Indian attack here. And this one is a bit of a tricky line. This also has some resemblance to, in my opinion, the close Sicilian, in that sometimes white is going to get a similar sort of kingside attack, which is a bit slower, but is also very dangerous. But basically the king's Indian attack, I mean, this can occur via a couple different move orders, and like the one that occurs via knight f3 here, and this is like Sicilian aside, just like in general speaking, white can go for like a move order of knight f3 and play g3, bishop g2, castles d3, e4, but they can also sort of play the king's Indian attack for a 1e4 move order immediately. And against the Sicilian, this is going to imply that they go for some sort of knight f3 move here, and then g3 or d3 and move 3, and then go for this sort of setup eventually. And similar to what I said with the Grand Prix, right, how like the strength of this opening depends on whether on move 2, black goes for something like e6 or d6 or knight c6. I also somewhat believe the same to be for the king's Indian attack here. For example, against e6, against people who go for like the Tamano Sicilian or the Khan here, like after something like takes, where the Khan would be, oh sorry, this is Taimano rather, and the Khan would be of a6 here. If you play against these sort of plays, the king's Indian attack is actually very good when black is playing e6 here, locking out their light with bishop. And for example, one way that play could actually continue is something like d5 here, d3. I'm not sure if this is the best move, or actually I think you might actually rather play d3 here. So against d5 you can go knight d2 and stops, for example here, d takes e4 on a trade of queens here. What's to say they don't trade queens here, they go this, we say bishop g2, bishop e7, and after castles we get this very famous sort of position in the king's Indian attack, which can arise by a bunch of different move orders actually. This can also arise via the French, where white goes d3 here and we sort of eventually transpose, while black plays c5. But basically coming back to this position here, what is so special about this? How is this dangerous? And basically it's the fact we have this wedge on e5. This is essentially going to be the rock of our attack here, which serves a bunch of different purposes. And essentially after some moves like this here, queen e2 backing up this pawn, black will try and launch their own queenside attack here, and we're going to start playing on the king side with moves like h4 here, knight f1, bringing this knight into the h2 square to g4, going h5, h6 if allowed. And there's a bunch of like really cool ideas. For example, let's just continue down this line. Bishop f4 is a very common idea. And one important thing to note here is that sometimes we could put a knight to h2 and put to g4 this way, but when we have a bishop on f4 here, we can also go knight e3 here. One idea being that, say, if like something like this here, we can actually take on d5 maybe, e6, we attack this, and we also create some discovered attack threats on this diagonal. In this position, I'm not exactly sure how dangerous this is, because after bishop d6, it looks like they kind of block it all off, and after like takes, the simplifications just kind of favor black, I think. But nonetheless, these sort of ideas are something to be aware of, and after like a position like this, you could also just go for something like h5 here, and if black plays h6, you might be going g4, g5, you might also go knight g4 and like sack a piece here. This is also very dangerous. But as I was saying earlier, I don't believe this to be as dangerous against stuff like knight 6 and d6 here. But nonetheless, it's like still perfectly playable. It's just not as dangerous here. Like for example here, if you want to sort of be nitpicky and play like the best lines against every single variation, here like for example, you probably wouldn't play d3 going for a king's Indian attack, you'd go bishop b5 going for the Ross and Limo. But if you just want like something simple to play against everything, I mean you could still go d3 here, it's just you won't be getting like the same sort of attacking lines that you get after e6 here, because I mean black's gonna go for some sort of like fianchetto here in this line here, where they go like g6 here, and they go for a more sort of positional, I guess you could call it, approach. They could also go e5 as we discussed before. They do weaken squares like d5, but it's not a big deal here. They could also go knight f6, and I mean we can't really go for the kingside attack like we did in the other lines because they've got the bishop fianchettoed here, but we could also go for something like more slow, like c3, a3, b4 is an idea, or c3, d4 if allowed, and white isn't really doing too bad in these positions here. And so now getting up to the A tier now, things are getting serious, right? We are going to be starting with the Alpen, like Alpen for A tier, right? Not really, but I mean the Alpen is a good variation. Right, hey guys, sorry it's a little bit dark now as you probably noticed in the background. I kind of screwed up recording this part a little bit, but now we're going to talk about the Alpen here. So basically, why is the Alpen in A tier here? And a big part of it is just simply that, especially at the lower levels, a lot of people really, they don't know what the hell they're doing, to be honest. They might go like d6 or something, they'll take here, they'll go e6. They play very passively, and they just allow white to gain the center for free basically here, which I mean, of course, we will take. However, as you start to climb the rating ladder a little bit, people will tend to play a little bit better moves here, which basically are either to play d5 or knight f6, immediately posing questions to the pawn on e4 here. Of course, like for example with d4 here, a big point is that now after takes, because the pawn occupies c3, we can't go knight c3, etc, etc. But generally here, like as these positions develop a bit, one pawn structure which is very important, and that if you play the Alp, you're going to have to be very comfortable playing with, is the isolated queen's pawn after something like c takes d4, c takes d4 here, where notice how white has the isolated queen's pawn. And now this isn't inherently like bad or anything, it's just like a pawn structure that is very common in chess, but generally speaking, this tends to be something which, like, just say that you have two players, they both don't know much about the pawn structure. Generally speaking, in that sort of scenario, the side that's playing it against it, at least in my opinion, is going to have a bit of an easier time. Generally, playing with the isolated queen's pawn, although it can provide a lot of sort of good attacking chances, usually requires a decent amount of knowledge to play it well. But that being said, don't let this discourage you too much. This is definitely something that you can learn, and given that, you know, whatever level you're at, people probably won't know a whole lot more than you, I wouldn't really let this discourage you. And also after knight f6, this is also another very common move here, e5, knight d5 here, d4 as we were looking earlier under the Smith-Morrow gambit here. Some very common moves here, bishop c4, this is kind of the most active square for the bishop here. And a very sort of common thing we will see here is something like knight c3. And after some moves like this, one might kind of be tempted to be like, okay, so our pawn structure kind of looks a little bit wrecked here, like this pawn on c3 is isolated. Well, that's the main thing, to be honest. Apart from that, we don't really have many other weaknesses. But still, I can imagine a certain type of player looking at this position being like, I don't really like the look of this. I want my pawn structure to be like really clean and tidy and perfect and whatnot. But this is one of the really cool points about the Alp, and especially these sorts of positions where you have the pawn on e5, is that, okay, our pawn structure is a little bit messy here, but because of the pawn on e5, this gives us a space advantage. It really restricts black's pieces here, and here after something like b6, we can activate our queen to this nice e4 square. Let's say bishop b7, bishop d3, target this, g6, bishop h6, all of our pieces just really sort of naturally fall into very active pieces here. Squares rather, rook e8 here, rook a d1, and really we see all of our pieces coming into play here. Our queen might sidestep out of this diagonal for a moment, then resume with something like h4, h5, maybe knight g5, hitting this. All in all, a very nice position for white. And now, this variation very much is sort of in the spirit of the Grand Prix, but in my opinion, this is an even better version of it. I'm not even sure what to call it. We're going to call it a pseudo Rossolimo because it somewhat resembles it, but it's basically in this position we're going to show right now, where in this position after knight c3 we looked at in this position like all sorts of stuff like g3, the close Sicilian, f4, even knight f3 we talked about briefly. We didn't dedicate a whole thing to it, but nonetheless that exists, trying to transpose in some sort of open Sicilian maybe. But there's also bishop b5 here, quite interesting, which very much resembles the Rossolimo, which I think we briefly talked about earlier here but haven't yet fully discussed. But there's a big difference here, which is that in this line here, is that we have a knight on f3 rather than a knight on c3. And well, what difference does this make here? And well, one of the big differences, I'm just trying to find where I am, excuse me, so knight c6 here, bishop b5, is that, okay, the knight on f3 not being developed, it has one pro, which is that we can now develop the pawn to f4 and sort of play somewhat in the style of the Grand Prix here. But the con, so to speak, is that because we don't have a knight on f3, we don't really control the d4 square as well, and black can play knight d4 in this position. But a lot of players won't really sense the urgency of playing a move like knight d4 here, and we'll just play a move like d6, which, I mean, by the way, it is playable here, but now after something like takes here, a lot of players will sort of go into this unknowingly when after some moves like f4 here, d3, knight f3, and white trying to execute, say, a similar attack like they do in the normal Grand Prix, right, where they go like, for example, moves like queen e1, queen h4, f5. This is just a very much improved version here because we got rid of the light squared bishop, which often has trouble sort of finding a good role in the game here. We exchange it off for that knight on c6, and this really just helps white in the attack here. I should also note that white scores really well here, unsurprisingly, which is once again like why, I mean, if you go pretty much anything but knight d4 here, we're going to take on c6. Unless black plays a move like queen c7 or something, trying to defend this knight here, then we won't take here because they can avoid the double pawns. But say after knight f3, if they go like a6 now, then we go like a quick d4 or something, and we just have a great lead development. But against knight d4, like what are we going to do? We could retreat with the bishop, but I like even more just playing with like knight f3 here, putting pressure on this knight. Black should go something like a6 here. And there's some more stuff you can look into. You can go bishop c4, there's even bishop d3, which looks slightly weird. One of the ideas is that in a bunch of these lines you'll end up taking this knight and going knight e2, and you'll counter this pawn with c3 here. And then eventually after takes you might go b takes c3, bishop c2, d4 in the center here. And if, by the way, in these positions, like black plays something like knight takes b5, and they like kick you away, I don't think that's the best move, but just as an example here, something that could happen is something like d4 here. And after this, you'll play queen takes d4, exploiting the fact that we exchanged this knight off earlier, so now they can't play knight c6 and harass this queen. And basically, white just has a very strong presence in the center, where it's difficult to kick their queen out. We're going to play bishop g5, long castles, maybe e5 if we can, clamp on the dark squares here, and we just have a very pleasant position with the lead in development. So for that reason, I really like the, I forget what I was going to call it, let's say pseudo Rossolimo here, where we go for bishop b5 on move 3. These lines with knight d4, we go knight f3 here. We could also go for some like bishop c4 stuff. I mean, technically that's like playable. And against like anything other than knight d4, we once again go like, well, takes here and then f4, and we get a very much improved version of the Grand Prix. And there's a nice recommendation to accompany this move, the pseudo Rossolimo we're going to call it. There's another very nice variation called the Carlsen variation here. And basically the Carlsen variation is what occurs here after, knight c3 here, d6 instead of knight c6. And the sort of kind of going bishop b5 here is now after bishop d7 takes here. We're going to see later on how in this line here, the Moscow variation, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, white quite enjoys these positions because we can play c4 here, or we can go like c3, d4, and I mean when we play c4, at least we're aiming for a Maroczy bind here with the pawns here, you get in the quick d4, and we have a nice base advantage. But when we play it this way here, notice how the white knight on c3 stops us from playing like c3, d4, we can't play c4, so this is really just a much worse version of the other line, the Moscow variation in my opinion. But one thing we can do in this line here that Magnus Carlsen introduced a couple years ago is you can play d4 here, and after c takes d4 you can play queen takes d4, which looks like a kind of stupid line at first because knight c6, right? And now the queen has to move somewhere, and basically what Magnus came up with was this move queen d2 here. And this looks even more stupid than the playing d4 and queen takes d4, because like what the hell is the queen doing on d2, right? It looks absolutely absurd. But the idea is that we actually have this simple setup of going b3, bishop b2, so now the queen on d2 kind of makes sense because we're not blocking in the bishop this way, and then we're going to castle long, and we're essentially going to have this very interesting opposite side castling position game here, and this is actually a very venomous weapon which should not be underestimated. For example, like play might continue something like this here, g6 maybe, bishop b2, long castles, this, we go f3 maybe, and basically our plan is to go like g4, h4, h5 maybe, and play somewhat in the spirit of like how we would against a dragon here with the sort of kingside pawn advances in the Yugoslav. Also, I should note that if you play knight c3 here, against d6 you can go d4, and against knight 6 you can go bishop b5, or once again you could go for something else, but against e6 it's not as obvious what you go for here. One recommendation could be to go like knight g2 here, and you go like g3 here, and you try to go for some stuff like this, where if they ever play d5, you go d4, and if they ever take, you try to play against an IQP here, and there's some like very precise lines where you go bishop g4 here, you allow them to take, which looks absolutely stupid, but basically, if you follow this through until the end, it's going to end up okay here. For example, if they just exchange a bunch of stuff here, this is completely fine. Queen b5 check will either win this pawn, or if they go queen d7, win this one, and then you have the bishop pair in an endgame, you're also forking this stuff, which is usually going to force something like bishop f3 here, but surprisingly after just takes here, actually no, I think you go king f1 rather here, and then takes. Again, we see this the same idea here, where if we go queen b5 check, we win back the pawn, and we have a good ending. And if they instead go something like takes here, this also isn't a big issue, because I mean, I think we actually looked at something like this earlier. And well, I should know, like, yeah, if we take here, then we get the whole queen b5 check stuff. But also, if they, like, just keep the knight there, I mean, like, of course, the issue is now we just take back and we win back the pawn. They simply have no way to avoid both of those sort of scenarios. But yeah, that was a bit of a side tangent with e6 here if you're going to play knight c3. But it is important if you're going to play, like, say, the Carlsen variation against d6, d4, and knight c6, bishop b5, the sort of pseudo Rossolimo here. You do need to know what you're doing against e6 here. You can't just play, like, d4 here. This is kind of stupid here, because knight c6 and This setup doesn't really work the same because I think like bishop b4 probably, whereas in the Carlsen variation this bishop was blocked in. And you can't also really play bishop b5 because, I mean, what the hell is the bishop doing, like, looking at this diagonal here if there's no knight in c6? Alright, but finally we are about to reach the end now. We are finally at the S tier. And the lines we're going to be looking at here is first of all going to be the Rossolimo / Moscow variations. And basically these lines, which we've already talked about, like, or at least alluded to a bunch of times throughout this video, is when black goes d6 here, we go bishop b5 check. When black goes knight 6, we go bishop b5. Against e6, once again, there's a little bit of a dilemma. A lot of people just transpose to the open Sicilian here. And generally the open Sicilians with e6 are considered slightly less not as good as some of the other ones, like say the Najov here where they go d6. And I've made a video about this, go check that out if you're interested. 30 ideas every Najov player must know here. Or say like the Sveshnikov, this is another one which is very sound. Magnus played this in his World Championship match in 2018 against Fabi. Got some very interesting positions. This is, of course, another sort of main line of the Sicilian. And in general, like the bishop b5 approaches against d6 and knight c6 seek to avoid rather these exact opening variations because they are just a bit sort of very tough to crack, especially at the top level. The lower you are, the less you have to worry about like openings being like bulletproof or bullshit like that, because quite frankly, if you're 1800, you can play whatever bullshit you want and you can win because people don't know what they're doing. But that's a bit of a different story. I made a video like way back last year. I probably didn't even have 100 subs at the time. I had like this video called like the biggest lie about openings. It was basically just talking about opening theory. It's a very short video. I'll put it somewhere up in the cards. But basically here, I mean, yeah, the Rossolimo, very, very solid opening. You can take here very quickly if you want a lot of these lines, like for example against g6. I mean, you can go for this sort of setup where you go for a very quick, you probably can't play this here because you can lose a pawn on b2, but I mean, yeah, you play some setups like these where, you know, it's very solid, right? You could also go for something like, in this position, castles here, rook e1, and go for something like this. Like if black plays e5, for example, there's some lines where you could take here, once again, transpose into similar stuff, but there's even like this gambit line with d4 here, or you could go c3 in this position. But generally, I'm just trying to show like what kind of options are out there. Also against like e6, I mean, you can take here, you can castle. That's one of the good things about the Rossolimo. There's a lot of flexibility in it while also being objectively strong. And as I was talking about earlier with the Moscow variation, right, if they go bishop d7, I've always liked facing this line a lot because you get the Maroczy bind stuff here, and I've always found this to be quite pleasant for the white pieces here. You get just a very nice sort of slight space advantage, which gives you sort of a slight advantage, I also feel, and you just sort of like squeeze away at black's sort of soul here. And if they go for something like knight takes d7, I don't think the Maroczy bind stuff works as well here. I think you have to go for something a bit more slow, like maybe c3, d4, or you could also even go like b3, I think, and approach this a little bit more slowly with c4, and then only d4 eventually here. Don't ask me why, there's some like very specific move order nuances or concrete theory as to why we do this, which is probably not appropriate for this video, but nonetheless, this stuff exists here. But the most critical move, I think, is knight d7. And like here, you need to know what you're doing, I think. Like you can go for a quick d4 here, and queen takes d4. I remember there was also like a keep simple 1e4 repertoire by Krzysztof Zielecki like a while ago that I went over, like 2018, 2019 maybe, where recommended c3, trying to play d4, and if they ever capture, you're capturing back the pawn. Objectively, this isn't best line, but practically, I think this is a good weapon for anyone like under 2000, because like it just makes a lot of logical sense, and playing opening lines you understand at the end of the day is never really a bad way to go about things. But yeah, that being said, that's pretty much all I have to say about the Rossolimo and Moscow variations. Probably if you don't want to go for the open Sicilian, this is one of the best lines I can really recommend. Although once again, if you want something a little bit more tricky, maybe like knight c3, bishop b5 is also pretty good with the Carlsen variation. It's a little bit more rare as well, so that can sort of factor in as a bit more of a surprise weapon, I guess you could say. And so we've saved this one for last, but I mean, I don't think there was any doubt in anyone's mind here that the open Sicilian was going to go into S tier here. So I mean, the open Sicilian, of course, is like a very sort of broad topic. There's so much that can be said about it that it's like we could have 20 videos just on this single topic, so it's not a whole lot I can say in a couple of minutes. But that being said, one thing I'll sort of tackle is I believe this misconception where a lot of people think that the open Sicilian, you know, like shit tons of theory to be able to play it. If you haven't read like 10 books on it, don't even bother. I don't necessarily think that to be true. Another thing that I don't think is necessarily true about it is it's always like this super sharp, aggressive sort of line. Sometimes, a lot of the times that is true. However, that would also be underselling the strategic component of the Sicilian, which is almost just as important in my opinion here. And especially in lines like, let's say, the Najor, for example, here. Not this, let's say d4 here. Like, okay, there are some very sharp lines here, like bishop g5, bishop e3, the English attack here. But there's also some more positional lines. For example, bishop e2. This was Karpov's favorite variation here. He played this in a shit ton of games when he was in his prime here, and he had a really good score for it. And it wasn't really these very like sharp games, he was just sort of like grinding his opponents out in a bit more of a positional style here. However, that being said, like, I'm gonna be honest, if you're gonna go to the effort of like learning the open Sicilian, because there's so many different variations you have to learn. For example, just in this position alone, not only do you have to learn the Najor, after a6, you have to learn g6, the dragon, you have to learn the classical knight c6. If your opponent plays knight c6, then after this, you have to learn the Kalashnikov, you have to learn the accelerated dragon, you have to learn the Taimanov, you have to learn the Sveshnikov, the list goes on, right? So to me, it feels like if you're going to learn all these lines, you may as well sort of play something more aggressive, you know? However, if you're really just seeking more of a positional, like slower style game here, like yeah, you can go Anatoly Karpov's bishop e2 on a lot of these open Sicilians and play them more positionally, but that was also like Anatoly Karpov's day, like the 70s, 80s and stuff, right? When like it was sort of considered that the open Sicilian, that was the only real way to play an advantage with the white pieces. However, this is like 2023, right? We know these days that like you don't have to necessarily play d4 to get an advantage, especially if you want to play something more of a positional nature. You can go for the Rossolimo. You can go for the other lines I talked about earlier where we go like knight c3 and bishop b5, or the Carlsen variation if they play d6 and you go d4. But at the end of the day, it is your choice. I just show you what I know, I tell you what I think, and then it is up to you to choose. But with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If there's any other tier lists that you'd like to see me make, leave a comment down below, and also like the video please. If you did like it, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. But anyways, I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you next time.